The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on the woman in the wheelchair. Her hands trembled as she pushed forward a thick stack of documents. The air was thick with tension as the opposing lawyer smirked, leaning back in his chair. Sheriff Dean, seated confidently at the defense table, crossed his arms, his lips curling into a sneer. "Mrs. Sarah Jenkins," the judge began, her voice firm. "You're under oath. Do you swear that what you're about to present is the truth?" Sarah's voice was steady, though her body quivered. "I swear." The jury leaned in, curious and skeptical. What could a single mother, barely able to walk, possibly have that could take down the most powerful man in the county? As Sarah unfolded the first piece of paper, her voice rang out. "This is a financial record showing a transfer of $50,000 from the county's budget into a private account linked to Sheriff Dean." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. The sheriff's smirk faltered. She continued, holding up another document. "This is a signed affidavit from a former deputy who was fired for asking questions about that account." The room erupted. The sheriff's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, this is outrageous." But the judge raised her hand. "Sit down, counselor." Sarah reached for a small flash drive. "And here," she said, holding it up, "is the video evidence proving that Sheriff Dean orchestrated a scheme to frame innocent citizens, including me, for crimes they didn't commit." The courtroom was in chaos. The jury sat wide-eyed, mouths agape. Sheriff Dean's face turned pale, and beads of sweat began to form on his brow. Before the judge could restore order, Sarah's lawyer stood, her voice sharp. "Your Honor, this evidence is admissible, and we demand justice." The gavel slammed. "Court will recess until this can be reviewed," the judge declared. Sarah's determined face remained calm, but her heart pounded. She knew the fight wasn't over. 6 months earlier, Sarah Jenkins was just another struggling single mother in Pinewood County. Born with a degenerative condition that left her wheelchair-bound, Sarah had always faced challenges. But nothing could have prepared her for what was to come. It all began when she noticed an unusual amount deducted from her welfare check. Already tight on money, she called the county office to investigate. Every call led to another dead end. No one could explain why her funds were missing or why other disabled residents she knew were experiencing the same. At first, she thought it was a clerical error. But then one morning, a letter arrived. It was a court summons, accusing her of welfare fraud. "What is this?" she asked aloud, staring at the papers in disbelief. "I haven't done anything wrong." Her son, 8-year-old Danny, came running into the room. "Mom, are you okay?" Sarah forced a smile, brushing a tear away. "I'm fine, honey. Just some mistake I have to clear up." But it was no mistake. At the courthouse, she met Sheriff Dean, a tall, imposing man who ruled Pinewood County like his own personal kingdom. He smirked as he handed her a folder filled with evidence against her, documents claiming she had forged signatures to steal money from government programs. Sarah was furious. "This is a lie. I didn't do any of this." Dean shrugged. "Tell it to the judge." Sarah quickly realized she wasn't the only one. At church that Sunday, she overheard a friend, an elderly woman named Mrs. Ruth, complaining about similar accusations. Then another man in the congregation mentioned how he'd been forced to sell his truck to pay off a debt he didn't owe. "Something's going on," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. Ruth nodded. "But what can we do? Dean runs this town." Sarah's determination grew. Over the next few weeks, she began piecing together stories from others. The pattern was clear. Sheriff Dean and his inner circle were exploiting the most vulnerable in the community. But confronting him wasn't easy. One evening, after leaving the library with a stack of research, Sarah noticed a shadowy figure standing by her car. Her heart raced as she approached, gripping her phone tightly. "Mrs. Jenkins," the man said, stepping into the light. It was one of Dean's deputies. "A word of advice, drop this. For your sake, and your boys." Sarah didn't flinch. "Is that a threat?" The deputy hesitated, then turned and walked away. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, poring over bank records, court documents, and testimonies. Danny played with his toy trucks nearby. "Mom, are you going to beat the bad guys?" he asked, his innocent eyes full of hope. Sarah smiled. "I'm going to try." But her resolve was tested when someone broke into her house a week later. Papers were scattered everywhere, and her computer was smashed. The message was clear. Sarah's lawyer, a young woman named Lisa Marks, was skeptical at first. "You're taking on a giant," she warned. "I don't care," Sarah said. "He's hurting people, and someone has to stop him." Together, they began building a case. Sarah tracked down whistleblowers and uncovered hidden transactions. Lisa filed subpoenas and fought tooth and nail to get evidence admitted in court. The journey was exhausting, and there were moments when Sarah wanted to give up. One night, after hours of work, she broke down in tears. Danny climbed on her lap and hugged her. "Don't cry, Mom. You're the strongest person I know." His words reignited her determination. By the time the trial began, Sarah was ready. But Sheriff Dean wasn't going down without a fight. His lawyers tried every trick to discredit her, calling her a desperate woman looking for attention. But Sarah refused to be intimidated. She presented her evidence with a calm confidence that left the jury questioning everything they thought they knew about their beloved sheriff. Back in the courtroom, as the judge banged her gavel to announce a recess, Sarah caught Sheriff Dean's eye. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid. She leaned over to Lisa. "This is just the beginning," she whispered. Lisa nodded. "Let's hope it's enough." But as Sarah rolled out of the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was far from over. And she was right. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, as she always did, her body sore from the constant strain of the chair. She could already feel the weight of the day ahead, the nerves crawling up her spine like ants. The trial was not over, and neither was the war. But today, the air felt different. Despite the shock of what had happened in court yesterday, revealing Dean's involvement in the county's financial scandal, Sarah knew the sheriff was a man who would not easily be defeated. His power ran deep. As she prepared breakfast for Danny, she couldn't help but replay the moments from the courtroom in her mind. The way the jury had looked at her when she presented the evidence. The stunned silence as the video of Dean's corrupt dealings played on the screen. But then there were the glances from Dean's lawyer, the smirks, the way they had immediately started to cast doubt on her credibility. A mother looking for attention was how they had labeled her. Sarah had expected it, but it still hurt. Danny tugged at her sleeve. "Mom, are we going to win today?" She smiled softly. As the hours ticked by, Sarah felt the pressure building in her chest. Every day since she had started this battle, she had faced one challenge after another. And now, with everything in the balance, it was like walking a tightrope. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. The courtroom was waiting for her again. This time, the stakes were higher. The trial resumed, and the tension was palpable. The jury had been instructed to return the next day, but today was crucial. Today was the day Sarah was set to present her final piece of evidence, a piece that could change everything. But Sheriff Dean had a plan of his own. The defense called its first witness, a former deputy who had worked closely with Dean. Sarah had been prepared for this. His testimony was exactly what they expected, a defense of the sheriff's character and reputation. But as the witness spoke, something felt off. Sarah's stomach twisted as she listened. The man spoke about Sheriff Dean like he was some kind of saint, the community's protector. His words were smooth, rehearsed, and the way he looked at Sarah made her uneasy. He was lying. "I don't believe a word of this," Lisa whispered under her breath, gripping the edge of her chair. But they had to stay calm. They couldn't afford to get rattled. When the defense finished, it was Sarah's turn to take the stand. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she wheeled herself up to the front, the entire courtroom watching. She knew she had to be strong. "You've heard the testimony of the previous witness," Sarah's lawyer said, her voice steady but cutting through the tension. "But now Mrs. Jenkins has something to say." Sarah held her head high, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, the scrutiny, the disbelief. But she couldn't stop now. She cleared her throat and spoke, her voice steady. "Sheriff Dean has been running this county like his personal empire. The evidence I've already presented to you proves that. But I have more, much more." The room grew quiet, and Sarah's words echoed in the stillness. "I have proof," she continued, "that Sheriff Dean has been using county resources for his personal gain. This includes not just financial mismanagement, but illegal activities that have hurt the very people he swore to protect. Sarah paused, watching the jury's reactions. Some faces were skeptical, others horrified. The defense lawyer stood up, ready to object. But the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "Let her speak." Sarah reached into her bag, pulling out a small, folded piece of paper. She held it up, her eyes fixed on the jury. "This," she said, "is a list of names. People who were wrongfully arrested by Sheriff Dean's orders. I've cross-referenced every name with the charges, and every single one of them was innocent. But Sheriff Dean used them to further his own agenda." The courtroom gasped. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Sarah began to list the names one by one. People from all walks of life: mothers, fathers, teachers, small business owners. Each one caught up in a scandal they didn't deserve. And then Sarah did something unexpected. She turned to face the jury directly. "I am not the only victim here," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but still resolute. "There are dozens of others, and I'm sure many of you have heard their stories. These people have been suffering in silence, just like I was, but now it's time for their voices to be heard." The defense lawyer was on his feet, trying to interrupt, but the judge gave him no chance. "Order in the court," she snapped. For the next few moments, Sarah allowed the evidence to speak for itself. She had gathered more than just documents. She had gathered the truth, and now the truth was out. But just as the momentum seemed to be turning in her favor, something happened that no one could have predicted. A man, dressed in dark clothing, stood up in the back of the courtroom. His face was obscured, but his presence was unmistakable. "Your Honor," the man called out, his voice sharp. "I have something important to add to this case." Everyone turned to look. The courtroom was instantly thrown into chaos. "Who is this?" the judge demanded. "I'm someone who knows the truth," the man replied, his eyes locked on Sheriff Dean. "And I'm here to testify." The defense lawyer objected loudly, but the judge allowed the man to approach the stand. Sarah watched as the stranger moved toward her, his face still hidden. Was this a trap, or was it the break she had been waiting for? But before the man could speak, Sheriff Dean stood up suddenly, his face pale. "I demand that this person be removed," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The judge didn't even flinch. "Let him speak." The tension in the courtroom thickened like a heavy fog. Every eye was fixed on the mysterious man who had just walked in and demanded to testify. Sarah's heart raced. Was this the breakthrough she had been waiting for? Or was this part of some last-ditch effort by Sheriff Dean to regain control of the situation? The man walked to the stand with slow, deliberate steps, his dark suit making him seem out of place, like a shadow in a room full of light. As he settled into the chair, the courtroom held its breath. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady and measured. "I'm here to tell you everything you need to know about Sheriff Dean." A murmur ran through the gallery. Dean stood frozen, his face drained of color. Sarah's lawyer, Lisa, exchanged a quick look with Sarah, both of them trying to process what was happening. The judge motioned for the man to continue. "You may proceed," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. The stranger cleared his throat before speaking again. "My name is Michael Hayes, and I worked as an investigator for the Pinewood County Police Department for over 15 years. I know things about Sheriff Dean that would shock you." Sarah's eyes widened. This was someone who could expose Dean from the inside out. Someone who knew him personally. She leaned forward in her chair, trying to absorb every word. Michael continued, his voice unwavering. "I've seen things, Your Honor. Illegal things. Sheriff Dean used his position to profit off of people's misery, blackmail, extortion, and worse. He's been using the county budget as his personal slush fund for years, and I have proof." The courtroom was dead silent. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. This was it. This was the moment she had fought for. Dean's hands gripped the edge of his table, so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came out in shallow gasps, his eyes darting nervously between the judge and the man now testifying against him. "You're lying," Dean finally managed to shout, his voice filled with rage. "This man has no credibility." But Michael Hayes didn't flinch. "I've been gathering evidence for months, Sheriff," he said, his voice calm but cutting through the tension. "I was one of your own deputies. I know what you've done, and now I'm here to make sure you pay for it." At that, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Michael Hayes had once been one of Dean's closest allies, and now he was turning against him in the most public way possible. The defense lawyer shot up from his seat. Objection. This testimony is inadmissible. This man is a disgruntled former employee with no real evidence to support. But the judge, surprisingly, waved the objection away. I'll allow the testimony. Let the jury hear what he has to say. The room was buzzing with disbelief. Michael Hayes had more to reveal, and everyone in the courtroom was on the edge of their seats, waiting for the bombshell to drop. I have records, Michael said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase and slamming it onto the witness stand. These are reports from within the department, detailing every illegal transaction, every bribe, every cover-up. And I can prove that Sheriff Dean used his office to extort money from local businesses in exchange for protection. A gasp echoed through the courtroom as Sarah's eyes darted between the documents in front of Michael and Dean, who was now visibly sweating. I've seen the sheriff take kickbacks for overcharging small businesses for things like permits and licenses, Michael continued. I've seen him intimidate witnesses and frame people for crimes they didn't commit. And the worst part? He made a fortune off the pain of the people in this town. Dean's face twisted in fury. This is all lies. You've got nothing on me, he shouted, but his voice cracked with fear. Michael ignored him, flipping through the documents in front of him. Here it is, he said, holding up a specific sheet of paper. This is a contract signed by the sheriff, agreeing to take a percentage of the profits from every drug deal that went through the county. And here's a bank record showing a transfer of $100,000 directly into his private account. The courtroom was stunned into silence. I'm sorry, Michael added, his tone softening slightly. But this is the truth. For a long moment, no one moved. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The weight of the revelation hung heavy over everyone. Dean's lawyer was pacing frantically now, trying to figure out how to spin this. Your Honor, we demand that this man's testimony be stricken from the record. This is nothing but a smear campaign. But the judge stood firm. I'll allow the testimony. We'll see where the evidence leads us. Michael turned back to the jury, his voice calm but resolute. I know this is hard to believe, but I was part of it. I helped cover up crimes. But now I'm here to make sure that the truth comes out, no matter the cost. It was the final blow. The jury, who had been quiet up until now, began whispering among themselves. Sarah could see it in their eyes. Doubt had been planted in their minds. The seed of truth had been sown, and there was no turning back. But Sheriff Dean wasn't ready to give up. He slammed his fist onto the table, causing everyone to jump. You can't do this to me. I am the law in this county. I've been serving this town for over 20 years. His outburst was so loud that even the judge flinched. Sit down, Sheriff, she commanded. You will not interrupt this trial again. Dean's anger was palpable. You're all making a huge mistake, he shouted, standing up abruptly. The courtroom descended into chaos as Dean's lawyer tried to regain control. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were locked on Michael Hayes, who had just taken down the man who had been terrorizing her and her son for months. This wasn't over yet, but for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was short-lived. Just as the judge called for a brief recess, Sarah received a text message from an unknown number. It simply read, "You've made a mistake. You have no idea what you've unleashed." Her stomach sank. Who could it be? And what did they mean? As she looked around the courtroom, she saw a few unfamiliar faces in the crowd. Were they watching her? Were they watching Michael Hayes? The unsettling feeling only grew stronger as she stared at the phone screen. Whoever had sent that message knew something she didn't, and she had a sinking feeling that the real danger was just beginning. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the cryptic message on her phone. You've made a mistake. You have no idea what you've unleashed. The words replayed in her mind, sending chills down her spine. Who would send her such a message, and why now, in the middle of the trial? For a moment, the world seemed to spin around her. She glanced around the courtroom, trying to spot anyone who might be watching her closely, anyone who looked like they might know something she didn't. But everyone seemed to be preoccupied with the chaos that had erupted after Michael Hayes' shocking testimony. Dean's defense team was in disarray, and the judge had called for a brief recess. The room was filled with the clatter of chairs being pushed back as people stood to stretch their legs and discuss what had just happened. The shockwaves of Michael's testimony were still rippling through the courtroom. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She could feel eyes on her back. "Mom, are you okay?" Danny's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him standing next to her, his small face full of concern. "I'm fine, buddy," Sarah said, forcing a smile. She slipped her phone back into her pocket, trying to appear calm. But the unease that had settled in her chest wasn't going away. Lisa, her lawyer, leaned in closer. "Sarah, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Sarah shook her head. "It's nothing. Just a message. Someone's trying to scare me." Lisa frowned, but before she could respond, a voice interrupted them. "Sarah Jenkins?" She turned toward the sound of the voice. Standing near the back of the courtroom was a man who looked vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place him. He was tall with dark hair, dressed in a black suit. His expression was serious, almost ominous. "That's me," she said cautiously. "I need to speak with you," he said, his voice low. "It's urgent." Before Sarah could respond, Lisa stepped in front of her, her protective instincts kicking in. "Who are you?" The man hesitated for a moment before pulling out a badge. "I'm with the FBI," he said, his voice steady. "I need to speak with Sarah Jenkins. It's about the case." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. FBI? Why would they be involved now? The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people realized who he was. But she couldn't help the growing sense of dread in her stomach. "Are you here to help?" Sarah asked, her voice shaky. The man nodded. "In a way. But you need to listen carefully, Mrs. Jenkins. You're in more danger than you realize." Before Sarah could react, Lisa spoke up. "Danger? What do you mean? What's going on?" The man looked around, making sure no one else was listening. "This case has attracted the attention of people much more powerful than you realize. People who don't want the truth to come out. People who are willing to do anything to protect Sheriff Dean and the system he's built." Sarah felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The weight of his words hung in the air. "Who are these people?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say much right now," the man replied, glancing nervously around the room. "But I can tell you that this trial is only the beginning. What Michael Hayes just revealed has set something in motion. And I'm not sure how much time you have before it all comes crashing down." Sarah's mind raced. She had known the stakes were high, but this was something she wasn't prepared for. "We need to get you to safety," the man continued. "There are people out there who are watching you, and they won't hesitate to act. If you want to finish what you started, you need to trust me." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She looked at Lisa, who was now staring at the FBI agent, her expression unreadable. "Let's go," Lisa said firmly, her protective instincts kicking in. "We don't have time to waste." But before they could leave, the man stopped them. "Wait," he said, his voice urgent. "You can't just leave. You need to understand something first. There's a bigger player in all of this, someone behind Dean pulling the strings. And if you're not careful, you'll be walking straight into their trap." Sarah swallowed hard. "Who is it? Who's behind all of this?" The man's face tightened. "I can't say. Not yet. But I will say this. You need to be ready for what's coming. The truth is powerful, but it's also dangerous." His words echoed in Sarah's mind as they made their way out of the courthouse. She had always known that standing up to Sheriff Dean wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't expected it to be like this. The people she thought she could trust, like Michael Hayes, were now tangled in a web of corruption and danger that was far bigger than she had imagined. As they stepped outside, the bright sunlight felt like a sharp contrast to the darkness that had descended on Sarah's world. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't check it. The message she had received earlier had unsettled her, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know who was behind it. Instead, she focused on the FBI agent, whose name she still didn't know. He led them to an unmarked car, the engine already running. "I'll take you somewhere safe," he said, opening the door for Sarah. "But you need to understand that once you're in, there's no turning back. This fight will change everything." Sarah hesitated for a moment, looking back at the courthouse. She had come so far, and now she was being told to leave it all behind. But she knew deep down that she had no choice. With a deep breath, she climbed into the car, followed by Lisa and Danny. The agent slammed the door shut and got into the driver's seat. As they drove away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was still to come. The trial was far from over, but now, Sarah knew, the real battle had just begun. The car sped through the streets, its tires humming on the pavement as Sarah's mind raced. Every word the FBI agent had said seemed to echo in her head. There's a bigger player behind Dean. But who? Who could be powerful enough to pull the strings of a sheriff? Someone Sarah had once thought was just a small-town tyrant. The agent's name, she realized, was still unknown. She glanced at Lisa, who was sitting next to her in the back seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Danny sat beside Sarah, his small face filled with confusion. He was too young to understand the full extent of the danger, but Sarah could see the unease in his eyes. She wrapped her arm around him, pulling him close. "What's happening, Mom?" Danny whispered. "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah replied softly. "But I promise we'll be okay." The agent kept his eyes focused on the road, his jaw tight with concentration. He wasn't offering much in the way of reassurance. His silence only added to the tension in the car. "We're almost there," he said abruptly, his voice sharp. "I need you to stay alert. And no matter what happens, don't trust anyone unless I say so." "Who's after us?" Lisa asked, her voice low but filled with urgency. "Who's the real enemy here?" The agent's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't answer right away. They turned onto a quieter street, the kind of road Sarah had never been down before. It was lined with old, dilapidated buildings and dark alleys that made her feel even more uneasy. "We'll talk when we get there," he said, his voice flat. "For now, stay calm and don't ask questions." Sarah nodded, but she could feel the knot in her stomach growing tighter. Whoever was behind this was powerful, and their reach seemed endless. She had already risked so much by standing up to Sheriff Dean, but now she realized that the battle was bigger than she could have ever imagined. Finally, the car stopped in front of a large, nondescript building. It looked like an old warehouse with dark windows and a single steel door. The agent quickly checked his surroundings before getting out and opening the door for Sarah, Lisa, and Danny. "Come on," he urged, his voice now laced with a sense of urgency. "We're not safe out here." They quickly filed out of the car, the sounds of their footsteps echoing in the quiet street. As they entered the building, Sarah could see that it was surprisingly well-maintained inside. The walls were concrete, and the space was divided into smaller rooms, each with its own lock and security system. "Welcome to our safe house," the agent said, glancing back at them. "For the time being, you'll stay here. No one can get to you." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You're putting us in a warehouse?" "Until we know who we're dealing with, yes. The fewer people who know where you are, the better," the agent replied curtly. Sarah didn't have time to argue. She needed answers, and right now, she needed to trust him whether she liked it or not. They were led down a narrow hallway to a room at the back of the building. It was simple, with a small cot in the corner and a few chairs scattered around. But it was safe, for the moment at least. Once inside, the agent locked the door behind them and pulled out his phone. "I need to make a few calls," he said, his voice low. "Stay here and don't go anywhere." Sarah nodded, but as soon as the door closed behind him, she felt the weight of isolation pressing down on her. She wasn't sure what to do with all the new information she'd just learned. "What now, Mom?" Danny asked, his voice full of uncertainty. Sarah sighed and ran her fingers through his hair. "I don't know, buddy, but we'll figure it out." Lisa paced the small room, her eyes darting between the windows and the door. "This isn't good, Sarah. We're being watched. They know we're here." "I don't think they know yet," Sarah replied, though her voice lacked conviction. She didn't know how she knew, but she felt it, like a shadow lurking just outside the door. After what felt like hours, the FBI agent returned. His face was grim, his brow furrowed with frustration. "I've got bad news," he said, walking straight to them. "The people behind Sheriff Dean, they're well-connected. More than we anticipated." Sarah's stomach dropped. "What does that mean? Who are they?" "I can't give you names just yet," the agent replied. "But I can tell you that these people have influence over not just this county, but the whole state. And they're not going to stop until they crush anyone who stands in their way." Lisa shook her head. So what? We just wait here until they come for us? The agent's expression hardened. No, we're going to hit them back. But first, we need to make sure the information Hayes provided doesn't get lost. We need to get it out there where it can't be ignored. How? Sarah asked, feeling a spark of hope. We're going to leak the evidence, he said, his voice steady. But we need to do it carefully. If we do it the wrong way, it'll be used against you. Sarah wasn't sure what he meant, but the mention of leaking evidence made her feel uneasy. And what happens to us after that? The agent didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to a small desk in the corner and began typing something on a laptop. We'll move fast, he said, but you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, things are going to get messy. And if we're not careful, we could be putting more than just our lives in danger. As he spoke, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. The danger wasn't just about Sheriff Dean anymore. It was about something far bigger and far more dangerous. Just tell us what to do, Lisa said, her voice sharp with determination. The agent turned and faced them. First, I need to make sure you're all ready. This fight isn't over. It's just begun. Just then, the door to the safe house crashed open with a violent force. Sarah's heart stopped. The agent's hand went immediately to his gun. But before he could react, the figure in the doorway spoke. Did you really think you could hide from me? It was a voice Sarah would never forget. Sheriff Dean. Sheriff Dean's hulking frame filled the doorway, his presence radiating raw intimidation. His eyes scanned the room, landing first on Sarah, then Lisa, and finally the FBI agent. He took a slow step forward, his boots thudding against the concrete floor. Well, he said, his voice dripping with malice. Looks like the little mouse thought she could outsmart the cat. The FBI agent immediately drew his weapon, pointing it squarely at Dean. Stop right there, he ordered, his voice steady despite the tension crackling in the room. Dean raised his hands slightly, but the smirk on his face remained. Relax, agent. I'm not here to cause trouble. Yet, Sarah felt Danny's small hands clutching hers tightly. She pulled him close, her heart racing. How had Dean found them? Weren't they supposed to be safe here? You've made a big mistake, Dean, the agent growled. Breaking into a federal safe house is a felony. You're already under enough fire as it is. Dean chuckled, his laugh echoing ominously. You think I care about your federal safe house? He gestured around mockingly. This place isn't exactly Fort Knox. Lisa stepped forward, her eyes blazing with anger. What do you want, Dean? Haven't you done enough damage? Dean's expression darkened, and the room seemed to grow colder. What do I want? I want this circus to end. I want that evidence buried so deep no one will ever find it. And I want all of you to disappear. Sarah found her voice, though it was shaky. You're afraid, aren't you? She said, her words trembling but defiant. You know the truth is coming out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Dean's smirk faltered, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. But it was quickly replaced by cold fury. You don't know what you're messing with, he hissed, stepping closer despite the gun trained on him. You think I'm the big bad? I'm nothing compared to the people I work for. You don't want to cross them, Jenkins. The FBI agent took a step forward, his gun still raised. Enough! Hands behind your head, Dean. You're under arrest. Dean didn't move. Instead, his smirk returned, and he reached into his pocket slowly. Stop right there, the agent barked. Dean paused, his hand hovering just inside his jacket. Relax, agent, he said, his tone mocking. It's just a phone. He pulled out a sleek black phone and held it up. You might want to answer the call coming your way, he said cryptically. Almost on cue, the agent's phone buzzed. He hesitated, his grip on his gun tightening. Don't, Lisa warned. But the agent lowered his weapon slightly and pulled out his phone, keeping a wary eye on Dean. The name on the screen made his face pale. Sarah noticed the change in his expression. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling. The agent didn't answer. He pressed the phone to his ear. This is Agent Carter. A deep, commanding voice boomed through the phone, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Agent Carter, stand down. You're interfering with matters above your pay grade. Carter's face tightened. With all due respect, sir, Sheriff Dean is a corrupt official under investigation. I can't. You can, and you will. the voice interrupted coldly. This isn't your fight anymore. Leave the sheriff and walk away. Sarah's stomach churned. Whoever was on the other end of that call was powerful, just like Dean had said. I'm not leaving, Carter said firmly. This case is... Agent Carter, the voice snapped. If you value your career and your life, you'll leave now. The call ended abruptly. Carter lowered the phone, his jaw clenched tightly. What was that about? Lisa demanded. Dean chuckled. Told you, he said, tucking his phone back into his pocket. You don't know what you're dealing with. Carter's hand trembled slightly as he raised his gun again. You think that scares me? It should, Dean replied, his voice calm but menacing. Sarah couldn't stay silent any longer. You're not untouchable, Dean, she said, her voice trembling but defiant. You might have people protecting you, but the truth will come out. It always does. Dean turned to her, his eyes narrowing. You're brave, Jenkins. I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you or your son. That was the last straw. Carter moved forward, grabbing Dean by the arm and slamming him against the wall. You've crossed the line for the last time, Carter growled. I don't care who you work for. You're done. But before he could cuff Dean, the sound of tires screeching outside froze everyone in place. Carter glanced toward the door, his grip on Dean tightening. Stay here, he ordered Sarah and Lisa, motioning for them to stay back as he moved toward the entrance. Dean smirked. Told you this wasn't over. Carter ignored him, his gun raised as he cautiously approached the door. Sarah held Danny close, her heart pounding in her chest. The door burst open, and 3 masked men stormed in, armed and moving with military precision. Get down, Carter shouted, firing off a warning shot. Chaos erupted. Sarah screamed, shielding Danny with her body as the masked men opened fire. Carter ducked behind a table, returning fire with precision. Lisa grabbed Sarah's arm. We have to move. But Sarah was frozen, her mind racing. The safe house was compromised, and now they were trapped. Dean, still pinned against the wall, shouted over the chaos. You'll never win, Jenkins. Never. Sarah clenched her fists, determination flooding her body. She didn't know how, but she would survive this. She would protect Danny, and she would expose the truth. As the gunfire continued to echo through the room, Sarah knew one thing for sure. The fight was far from over. Bullets ricocheted off the walls as Sarah clung to Danny, her body trembling with fear, but her mind racing with survival instincts. Lisa crouched beside her, shielding them both as chaos erupted around them. Agent Carter fired back with precision, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. The 3 masked men moved like professionals, their weapons trained and their movements coordinated. One of them flanked Carter, forcing him to duck behind an overturned table. Stay down, Carter shouted, his voice strained. Lisa grabbed Sarah's arm. We can't stay here. We'll be sitting down. Sarah looked toward the far side of the room. There was another door, slightly ajar, leading to what appeared to be a storage area. It wasn't much, but it was their only chance. Over there, Sarah whispered, pointing toward the door. Lisa nodded, her jaw set. Okay, but we have to move fast. On my count. The gunfire was deafening. Carter was holding his own, but it was clear he couldn't keep the attackers at bay for long. 1, 2, 3, Lisa shouted. She pushed Sarah and Danny forward, staying low as they crawled toward the storage room. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she gripped Danny's hand tightly. She could feel his small fingers trembling in hers. It's okay, sweetie, she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. They reached the door and slipped inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with metal shelves stacked with boxes and supplies. It wasn't much of a hiding spot, but it was better than being out in the open. Lisa closed the door quietly behind them, locking it with a trembling hand. That won't hold for long, she muttered. Sarah glanced around, searching for anything they could use. There has to be another way out, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Danny tugged at her sleeve, his wide eyes filled with fear. Mom, what's happening? Who are those men? Sarah knelt down, pulling him into a tight hug. They're bad people, honey, but we're going to be okay. I promise. She hoped her words would calm him, but they felt hollow even to her. Lisa interrupted. Look, She pointed to a small vent near the floor on the opposite wall. It's small, Lisa said, but it might be big enough for Danny. He could crawl through and find help. No, Sarah said immediately, shaking her head. I'm not sending him out there alone. Then what do we do? Lisa asked, her voice rising with frustration. Before Sarah could answer, the sound of heavy boots approached the door. The attackers were close. Find another way in, one of them barked, his voice muffled but menacing. Lisa cursed under her breath. They're going to break down the door? Sarah's mind raced. She looked around the room again, desperate for a solution. Her eyes landed on a metal shelving unit filled with boxes labeled emergency supplies. Help me move this, she said, pointing to the shelf. Lisa hesitated for a moment before rushing to Sarah's side. Together, they pushed the heavy shelf in front of the door, creating a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't hold forever, but it might buy them some time. The sound of pounding on the door sent a jolt of fear through Sarah's body. Open up, or we'll blow the door, one of the men shouted. Lisa grabbed Sarah's arm. We have to use the vent. It's the only way. Sarah looked at Danny, her heart breaking at the thought of sending him into the unknown. But they didn't have a choice. Okay, she said, her voice shaking. Danny, listen to me. You're going to crawl through that vent, and you're going to find a safe place to hide. Don't come out until it's safe. Okay. Danny's eyes filled with tears. But what about you? We'll be right behind you, Sarah lied. I just need you to be brave for me, okay? Danny nodded, his small face determined despite his fear. Lisa pulled the vent cover off and helped Danny climb inside. He turned to look at Sarah one last time, his lip trembling. I love you, Mom, he whispered. I love you too, baby, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Danny disappeared into the vent, and Sarah turned back to Lisa, tears streaming down her face. What now? Lisa asked, her voice low and urgent. The pounding on the door grew louder. The attackers weren't waiting any longer. We fight, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the terror in her heart. Lisa grabbed a metal rod from one of the shelves, while Sarah armed herself with a heavy wrench. They positioned themselves near the door, ready for the inevitable. The door burst open with a deafening crash, sending the shelving unit flying across the room. The masked men stormed in, their weapons raised. Into the line, one of them growled, his gun trained on Sarah. But before he could pull the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the building. The lights flickered, and the sound of sirens filled the air. Backup's here. Carter's voice rang out from the main room. The attackers hesitated, glancing at each other in confusion. Taking advantage of the distraction, Sarah swung the wrench with all her strength, striking the nearest man in the arm. He cried out in pain, dropping his weapon. Lisa followed suit, jabbing her metal rod into another attacker's side. Chaos erupted as the women fought back with everything they had. But it wasn't enough. One of the attackers grabbed Sarah by the arm, yanking her wrench away and shoving her to the ground. She gasped as her head hit the cold concrete. Time's up, the man snarled, raising his gun. Before he could fire, a deafening bang echoed through the room. The man staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, and fell to the ground. Carter appeared in the doorway, his gun smoking. Not today, he said, stepping inside and aiming at the remaining attackers. The men scrambled to retreat, realizing they were outmatched. As they fled, Carter turned to Sarah and Lisa, his face grim. Are you okay? He asked, his voice urgent. Sarah nodded weakly, struggling to sit up. Danny, he's in the vent. Carter's eyes widened. We'll find him, but we need to get you out of here first. As he helped Sarah to her feet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The people behind Dean weren't going to stop until they silenced her for good. And now, Danny was out there alone. The sound of sirens faded into the distance as Carter led Sarah and Lisa out of the wrecked safe house. The night air was thick with tension, and Sarah's legs, though they couldn't carry her, seemed to vibrate with unease as Carter pushed her wheelchair briskly toward the waiting SUV. We don't have much time, Carter said sharply, scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. Whoever sent those men knows we're a threat. They won't stop. But Danny, Sarah choked out, panic rising in her throat. He's out there alone. We have to find him. We will, Carter said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. But we can't do that if we're dead. We need to regroup and plan. Lisa helped Sarah into the SUV, her movements quick but unsteady. What's the plan? Lisa asked, her voice low but tight with anger. Because right now, it feels like we're barely keeping our heads above water. Carter slammed the driver's door shut and started the engine. The plan is to get you both somewhere safe and find Danny. Then we end this? Sarah's chest tightened as the SUV sped down the empty streets. Her mind raced with images of Danny crawling through the vent, scared and alone. She had promised him they would be right behind him. Now, every second felt like a betrayal. Danny's small hands gripped the cold metal of the vent as he crawled through the narrow space. His heart pounded in his chest, each sound amplified in the echoing tunnel. He didn't know where he was going, only that his mom had told him to keep going until he found a safe place. The vent turned sharply, and Danny hesitated, listening. He thought he heard voices, low, hushed murmurs, coming from somewhere below. His breath hitched as he realized the vent was sloping downward, leading him closer to the source of the sound. Don't stop, he told himself. Mom said to. He pushed forward, the metal scraping against his knees and palms. The voices grew louder, and he recognized one of them immediately. Sheriff Dean. Danny froze. His whole body tensed as he peered through the slats of the vent. Below, he could see Dean standing with a group of men, their faces obscured by shadows. The room was dimly lit, the glow of a single bulb casting eerie shadows on the walls. What do you mean the mission failed? Dean's voice was sharp, laced with fury. One of the men stepped forward, his face partially visible. The agent was there. He intervened before we could finish the job. Jenkins and the others got away. Dean slammed his fist on the table, making Danny flinch. I told you idiots this had to be clean. If Jenkins makes it to the press with that evidence, we're all finished. The man lowered his head. She won't. We'll track her down. Dean leaned in close, his voice a low growl. You'd better. Because if she talks, the people upstairs won't just take me down, they'll take all of us down. Danny's breath caught in his throat. His mom had been right. Sheriff Dean wasn't acting alone. There were others, powerful people, pulling the strings. And now Danny had overheard their plans. Suddenly, the vent creaked under his weight. Danny froze, his eyes wide with fear. Below, the men stopped talking, their heads snapping upward. What was that? One of them asked, reaching for a weapon. Danny's heart pounded as he quickly backed away, the metal groaning beneath him. He turned and crawled as fast as he could, his small body trembling with fear. The sound of boots echoed below him, growing louder with every passing second. He's in the vents, Dean shouted. Find him. Danny's mind raced as he scrambled through the tunnel, tears streaming down his face. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. Back in the SUV, Sarah was barely holding it together. Every second that passed without Danny felt like an eternity. She clutched Lisa's hand tightly, her knuckles white. Where do we start looking? She asked Carter, her voice breaking. He's just a kid. He doesn't know where to go. Carter's jaw tightened. We'll start at the safe house. He couldn't have gotten far. As they approached the wreckage of the building, Carter slowed the SUV, his eyes scanning the area. The site was eerily quiet, the chaos of the attack now replaced by an unsettling stillness. Stay here, Carter said, grabbing his gun and stepping out of the vehicle. Sarah and Lisa watched as he disappeared into the shadows, their anxiety mounting with each passing moment. The minutes felt like hours before Carter returned, his face grim. There's no sign of him, he said. But I found this. He held up a small notebook, its cover smudged with dirt. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. That's Danny's. He must have dropped it. Carter nodded. It means he made it out. But he's on foot, and if Dean's men are still in the area, we have to find him, Sarah interrupted, her voice fierce. I don't care what it takes. Lisa leaned forward. What about the vent system? If he crawled through, it has to lead somewhere. Carter's expression shifted as the realization hit him. The vents lead to the lower levels. If he made it far enough, he could be under the building. But that's enemy territory. Then we go in, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear in her chest. Carter hesitated. It's too dangerous. We don't know how many men Dean has down there. Sarah locked eyes with him, her voice unwavering. That's my son. I'll go alone if I have to. Carter sighed, running a hand through his hair. Fine, but we do this carefully. No one else is getting hurt tonight. Danny's small body ached as he crawled through the seemingly endless vent. He could still hear the men searching for him, their shouts echoing in the distance. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Finally, the vent opened into a larger space, and Danny tumbled out, landing hard on the cold concrete floor. He winced, his knees scraped and bloody, but relief flooded him as he realized he was alone. He looked around the room, his breathing heavy. It was dark, with only a faint light coming from a crack under the door. He didn't know where he was, but for the moment he was safe. Or so he thought. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. Danny's heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, looking for a place to hide. His eyes landed on a large metal cabinet in the corner of the room. He darted toward it, pulling the door open and slipping inside just as the door to the room burst open. Check every inch, a voice growled. The kid's here somewhere. Danny held his breath, his tiny body pressed against the cold metal. He could hear the men moving around the room, their boots thudding against the floor. Please don't find me, he thought, his eyes squeezed shut. The cabinet door rattled, and Danny's heart nearly stopped. The cabinet door rattled harder, and Danny felt tears sting his eyes as he tried to stay silent. The metallic clang of boots and the harsh breathing of the men searching for him filled the room. One of the men muttered under his breath, "Kids, quick. Check the vents again." Danny held his breath, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure they could hear it. The cabinet shook once more, but then the footsteps moved away. Through the small slits in the cabinet door, Danny saw the men regroup near the room's exit. "Let's fan out," one of them said. "If he's here, we'll find him." The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Danny alone once more. His muscles ached from tension, but he didn't dare move until he was certain they were gone. When the room was silent again, he slowly pushed the cabinet door open and peeked out. The room was empty. For now, Danny climbed out, his small hands gripping the edge of a nearby table for balance. His knees were scraped and his palms stung, but he knew he couldn't stop. He had to find his mom, and he had to get out of this place. He scanned the room and spotted another door on the far side. It looked heavy with a security panel next to it, but it was slightly ajar. Danny approached it cautiously, his small fingers trembling as he pushed it open. Meanwhile, Sarah, Lisa, and Carter were making their way through the lower levels of the building. The air was damp and smelled of mildew, and every sound echoed ominously. Carter led the way, his gun drawn, his movements deliberate and cautious. "We're getting closer," Carter whispered, glancing over his shoulder at Sarah. "If he's down here, we'll find him." Sarah nodded, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. Every step felt like an eternity, and the fear for Danny's safety was almost unbearable. Lisa carried a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. "What's the plan if we run into Dean's men?" she asked. Carter didn't hesitate. "We neutralize the threat and get Danny out. No risks, no mistakes." Sarah tightened her grip on the wrench she was carrying. "I'm not leaving without him," she said, her voice firm. They turned a corner and came across the vent system. Carter knelt down to inspect it. "He came through here," he said, pointing to a few small scuff marks on the floor. "These are fresh. He's close." Sarah's heart leapt. "Danny," she called softly, her voice echoing through the hall. Carter shot her a warning look. "Keep it down. We don't know who else is listening." But Sarah couldn't help herself. "Danny," she called again, her voice trembling. For a moment, there was silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere up ahead, they heard a small, trembling voice. "Mom?" Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Danny," she shouted, her voice breaking. Carter motioned for her to stay behind as he moved toward the sound, his gun raised. "Stay close," he whispered to Lisa, "and keep your eyes open." Danny's voice had been faint, but it was enough to spark hope in Sarah's heart. She gripped Lisa's arm tightly as they followed Carter through the dimly lit hallways, the sound of their footsteps echoing softly. "Danny, keep talking," Sarah called, her voice trembling. "I'm here, Mom." Danny's voice came again, a little louder this time. They turned another corner and saw him. Danny, his small frame illuminated by the faint light spilling in from the open door behind him. He was standing in the middle of the hallway, his face pale but his eyes wide with relief. "Danny!" Sarah cried, wheeling herself toward him as fast as she could. Danny ran to her, throwing his arms around her neck. "Mom, I was so scared." Sarah held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "It's okay, baby. I've got you. You're safe now." Carter and Lisa stood guard, their eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. "We need to move," Carter said. Dean's men could be back any second. But before they could take another step, the sound of approaching footsteps froze them in place. "They're here," Lisa whispered, gripping her flashlight like a weapon. Carter stepped forward, his gun raised. "Get ready," he said, his voice low. The footsteps grew louder, and then, out of the shadows, Sheriff Dean appeared, flanked by two of his men. His face was twisted with fury, his eyes locking onto Sarah and Danny. "Well, isn't this touching?" Dean sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Reunited at last. But you're not going anywhere." Sarah pulled Danny behind her, her hands shaking. "Stay away from us, Dean." Dean chuckled darkly. "You've caused enough trouble, Jenkins. It's time to end this." He nodded to his men, who raised their weapons. Carter fired first, the gunshot echoing through the hallway. One of Dean's men dropped to the ground, clutching his arm. "Go!" Carter shouted at Sarah and Lisa. "Take Danny and run." Sarah hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't want to leave Carter behind, but she knew they had no choice. "Come on, Sarah," Lisa yelled, grabbing the handles of the wheelchair and pushing her forward. They ran down the hallway, Danny clutching Sarah's hand tightly. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, but they didn't look back. They reached another door at the end of the hall, and Lisa shoved it open, revealing a staircase leading up to the surface. "Go! Go!" Lisa urged, her voice frantic. As they climbed the stairs, the sound of gunfire faded, replaced by the pounding of their own hearts. When they finally emerged into the cool night air, Sarah collapsed into the chair, clutching Danny to her chest. They were safe for now, but Carter was still down there, and Dean wasn't going to stop. Sarah looked at Lisa, her face pale but determined. "This isn't over," she said. Lisa nodded. "Not even close." The cool night air did little to calm Sarah's racing heart. She held Danny tightly, his small body trembling against hers. Lisa knelt beside them, her breathing labored, her eyes darting toward the dark stairwell they had just escaped from. "We can't leave Carter down there," Sarah said, her voice resolute despite the fear that gripped her. Lisa shook her head. "If we go back, we might not make it out alive." He knew what he was getting into. He wanted us to get you and Danny to safety. Sarah's eyes welled with tears. "I can't just leave him. He's the only reason we've made it this far." The sound of distant shouting broke through the night. Dean's men were still searching, their voices echoing like a grim reminder that the danger wasn't over. Lisa grabbed Sarah's shoulder. "We have to move. If they find us, everything Carter fought for will be for nothing." Sarah hesitated, her mind torn between saving the man who had risked everything for her and protecting her son. But before she could decide, a figure emerged from the stairwell. Carter. He was bloodied, his shirt torn, and his gun hanging limply in his hand. But he was alive. "Carter!" Sarah cried, relief washing over her like a tidal wave. He staggered toward them, a grim smile on his face. "Dean's not going to follow," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let's just say he's got bigger problems now." "What do you mean?" Lisa asked, her brow furrowing. Carter collapsed onto the ground, leaning heavily against the wall. "I leaked the evidence," he said, his words coming out in gasps. "All of it. The files, the video, the financial records. It's out there now, on every major news outlet, every social media platform. Dean's empire is crumbling as we speak." Sarah stared at him, her mouth agape. "You did it? You got the truth out?" Carter nodded, a faint grin spreading across his face. Yeah. And Dean's bosses? They're going to turn on him to save themselves. He's finished. Lisa let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. You're sure? He can't come after us? Carter's grin faded. Dean won't. But the people behind him? They're still out there. They'll try to cover their tracks, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who knows too much. Sarah's heart sank. The fight wasn't truly over, but at least the first battle had been won. What do we do now? She asked. Carter pushed himself to his feet, wincing as he moved. You lay low. Take Danny and disappear for a while. The FBI is already investigating the higher-ups, but it's going to take time. Until then, you stay off the grid. Sarah shook her head. I can't just run. People need to know what happened here. They need to know what Dean and his people did to this town. And they will, Carter said, his tone firm. But you need to stay alive to see it happen. Danny clung to Sarah's side, his small voice breaking the tense silence. Mom, are we going to be okay? Sarah looked down at him, her eyes softening. Yes, baby. We're going to be okay. I promise. 2 weeks later, Sarah watched from a small motel room as the evening news played on the television. The anchor's voice was steady, but filled with urgency as he detailed the fallout from the leaked evidence. Sheriff Dean of Pinewood County has been arrested on charges of corruption, extortion, and conspiracy. Federal investigators have confirmed that multiple high-ranking officials tied to Dean's operation are under investigation. This story continues to develop, but the bravery of one woman, Sarah Jenkins, has brought this widespread corruption to light. Sarah turned the television off, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sadness. They had won the battle, but the scars of what they had endured would remain. Danny sat beside her, his head resting on her shoulder. You did it, Mom, he said softly. You beat the bad guys. Sarah kissed the top of his head, tears welling in her eyes. We did it, sweetheart. Together. Lisa entered the room, a bag of groceries in her hand. News looks good, she said, placing the bag on the small table. Dean's not getting out of this one. Sarah nodded. But Carter was right. It's not over. The people behind him are still out there. Lisa placed a comforting hand on Sarah's shoulder. We'll deal with them when the time comes. For now, we rest. You and Dan. Sarah sighed, her gaze drifting to the window. The world outside felt different now, quieter, safer. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. And though she knew the fight wasn't truly over, she also knew she wasn't alone. Together, they had faced the worst. And together, they would face whatever came next.